Audience discretion is advised due to potentially distressing and sensitive material. Shannon Mohr was 25 and had just left two disastrous relationships. Her friends and parents kept encouraging her to get out there and meet someone new. They assured her there were good men out there. She resisted at first, but since her life had become all about her job, she was a nurse, she decided to go out, have some fun, and get her mind off things for a while. She went to a friend's wedding near Toledo. Shannon was walking around talking to her friends, blowing off some steam, when she was approached by a handsome man. His name was David Robert Davis. He swept Shannon off her feet instantly, and they started dating. David was 34, an international property developer. He was a former University of Michigan graduate student in pharmacology. Even though he was an orphan, he had become a millionaire at a pretty young age and had also served in Vietnam. Within 7 weeks, David proposed to her and Shannon said yes. Her parents Bob and Lucille were not on board in the beginning, but after a while they became fans of David. Lucille believed that her daughter's marriage was made in heaven, and Bob approved of him, describing him as a man's man who was really likable. So they tied the knot in Las Vegas and moved to a small farm in the small Michigan community of Pittsford. When they got to the farm, Shannon was surprised at the appearance of the place. David had told her and her parents that he was a millionaire, but the farm was pretty old and looked run down. David told her that it was just the economy and he was being smart about his investments. The second the economy got better, he would sell some lands and fix the place up just the way Shannon wanted. She didn't care about the farm though. She was just happy to be there with her new husband. She looked forward to the future. She felt like she'd just won the lottery. Shannon was truly in love with David. She adored him. She sat on his lap and kept telling everyone how amazing and different he was. Whenever he told them stories of Vietnam, Shannon would hang on his every single word. Married life was good to Shannon. She spent a lot of time with David, and her parents often came to visit them, and David was always so nice and sweet to them, so it didn't bother her when she realized the only money coming into the Davis household was the money she made as a nurse. She thought that things would pick up and everything would be okay. After all, she'd married a millionaire. Of course he was smart and knew what he was doing with his money. Shannon especially loved the company of her new neighbors, Dick Britton and his wife. They were such nice people, and they all became fast friends. But one night when Shannon was walking outside with her wife, she said the most peculiar thing. She said, "We love having you here." It wasn't the same when his ex-wife was around. We weren't so close. It was like being hit by a bus. She didn't understand what she was hearing. The ex? What ex? She'd never heard of an ex. She let it go and just pretended that she didn't know the ex's name and was just confused about it. The same night, she goes home and starts looking through David's stuff and finds women's clothes that didn't belong to her. She confronted David. At first, he tries to flap it away by just denying the whole thing. But then he breaks down and admits not only to having been married in the past, but also to having 2 daughters who his wife won't let him see. Shannon chalks up the whole thing to him being hurt, cause he's not able to see his girls, and lets it go. Probably because she was raised a Catholic and knew that she had to do everything in her power to hold onto her marriage. She never spoke of this to anyone. On July 23, 1980, 10 months into the marriage, Shannon's parents come to visit. They just drop by, and David gets really upset. Shannon can't understand what's happening, but by that point, she's also questioning his lies and behavior. It was so obvious that even her parents caught on and knew something was going on. David was always so pleasant with them, so they weren't particularly alarmed or anything. It was just weird. David pulled Shannon aside and asked her to go horse riding with him, like they often did. He said they needed to spend some time together without her parents, who were planning on staying the night. They go off with their horses, and unlike the other times, David doesn't let anyone else accompany them. Within 25 minutes or so, Robert, their neighbor, sees David riding towards his farm like a maniac. He doesn't know what's going on and keeps shouting for him to slow down before he hurts someone. The second David gets to him, he starts shouting that Shannon has had an accident and he needs his help to get her to the nearest hospital. David and Robert find Shannon lying on the ground. Her head was bleeding and she wasn't moving. They quickly take her to the closest hospital, where Shannon is sadly pronounced dead. Shannon's parents, Bob and Lucille, are called and they come to the hospital only to find out their only daughter has passed away. They see David in pieces. He's just sitting there with scratches on his face. He looks like he's in shock. The whole thing happens so fast. The police show up at the hospital and, as part of standard procedure, ask David some questions. The usual. What happened? How'd you get the scratches? Did you have life insurance? Write up their report and leave. But strangely, while they were still at the hospital, David starts insisting that Shannon should be cremated, because that is what she wanted. Bob and Lucille start begging him not to do it. After all, Shannon was raised Catholic. She'd never want that, plus her parents needed a grave they could visit. This just couldn't happen, but David keeps insisting. After a while of this going on, Robert steps in and tells him that they've had her for 25 years. You had her for one. Let them do what they want with their daughter's body. David backs down and leaves. The next morning, David pays Robert a visit. Robert brings him some coffee and they just sit there without saying a word, looking into the distance. Out of nowhere, David asks, "Do you know if the neighbor still wants to sell his land?" Robert is all confused. He loses it and starts yelling at David, saying, "How could you be talking about this when your wife died yesterday?" David just picks up and leaves. Within 3 days of the accident, Shannon is buried. But it was strange. David seemed unfazed. You wouldn't think he had any relationship with the deceased. Everyone was wondering if he was in shock, but it didn't seem so. He was unusually calm and collected. But this is not the strangest thing that happened at the burial. A man and a woman come up to Bob and Lucille and offer their condolences. They go on to say that they're David's parents and they are sorry that they didn't get the chance to meet them and their daughter before today. And you remember that David was supposed to be an orphan. So Bob and Lucille are totally confused by this point, but at the same time, they want to poke them for more information. They learn that David was never in Vietnam. As a matter of fact, he was never in the service. He never went to med school and was certainly not a millionaire. This all fueled the suspicions Lucille already had. Because remember we talked about the hospital when the police were asking him routine questions? Well, they asked him if there was any life insurance and he flat out said no. And his neighbor Robert saw him say no to the police. But Lucille remembered that shortly after they got married, Shannon had told her that David had taken out a pretty large life insurance policy on her. And not only this, but days after the funeral home was contacted by 6 different insurance companies who were requesting a copy of Shannon's death certificate. Apparently, David was already calling them asking when he could collect the money, and her death left David the beneficiary of $330,000. Meeting David's parents only made Bob and Lucille more certain that their daughter's death was no accident. And what do you expect? The information David's parents gave them was just insane. Of course, they would erase everything they thought they knew and go after him. They keep digging and they find out that this is not the first time David has done something like this. He was involved in other insurance scams as well. Apparently, this guy had set fire to a farm across the road from his old house to collect the insurance money, and he also faked a head injury when he was working at a company to collect disability. I mean, this guy was working on scams his whole adult life. He started small, but he was apparently making his scams bigger and nastier. So Bob and Lucille start pressuring the authorities to exhume Shannon's body and perform an autopsy since there was no autopsy done when she first died. Shannon's body is exhumed and they find injuries on her consistent with a fall from a horse. But they also find traces of an unknown drug. Still, the medical report rules her death an accident. Bob and Lucille, determined to catch this guy, turned to Detective Brooks, who was a newbie, but was still willing to help because he also found the whole thing odd and agreed that there was foul play involved in Shannon's death. He starts with what they had, the drug in Shannon's system, but there was no way to find what drug they were dealing with, and the toxicologist himself even told Brooks that he needed his help in identifying the drug. So they start contacting the vets in the area to ask if they knew of any drug that the farmers used on large farm animals that could affect the muscular or nervous system, and one of them gave them the name of a drug that did exactly that: succinylcholine chloride, an animal tranquilizer. If you don't know what this drug does, it causes massive paralysis of the muscles that are responsible for breathing. I know, this guy keeps getting worse and worse, doesn't he? As it turns out, the drug matched what was in Shannon's system. Now all Brooks had to do was connect the drug to David. He found out that David had taken part in a deer hunting camp where members used succinylcholine chloride to hunt deer. Shannon's cousin had even seen the drug at their farm with several syringes. So again, they were forced to dig up her body to check if there were any needle marks on her body. And what do you know? There was one on her shoulder and one on her wrist. There were also several bruises on her body. There you have it. David's arrest warrant was on its way. And this was not the only damning evidence against him. Brooks was questioning everyone in David's life. He found out that David had obtained a Florida driver's license under another name before he murdered Shannon. He also found out that David had been looking for a victim for a while at this point. Apparently, David had proposed to 5 of his exes before Shannon, and Shannon was the only one who said yes and became the victim of his crime. And get this, he'd gone traveling with an ex who was again his girlfriend at that point the day after Shannon's funeral. He also brought a girl to Shannon's funeral telling her that he was a CIA agent, and this was the final act of his assignment, so it didn't matter if she accompanied him. And he'd lied to all of his exes and girlfriends. Some knew nothing of Shannon's death and thought Shannon was alive and well and was dragging David's name through mud because of an obsession she had with him. Some thought he was a CIA agent. Brooks believed that David had got Shannon off the horse under the pretext of wanting to have sex, and got her all comfortable, then injected her with a drug and bashed her head with the only rock around. I mean, what was this guy thinking? Seriously? You think people would buy that Shannon hit her head on the only rock in the area? And the scratches on his face were not the doing of branches when he was riding on his horse to get help. They were defensive wounds. But because Shannon was injected with a tranquilizer, she couldn't do much damage. Unfortunately, by the time all this went down, David was nowhere to be found. Anyway, 8 long years go by, but no one gives up. Not Brooks, not Bob, and not Lucille. And there is this program on TV called Unsolved Mysteries that talks about how David had murdered his wife and was still at large after 8 years, and asks for information on his whereabouts. Within days of the repeat broadcast, David is finally captured. The police is contacted by a viewer in the United States who identifies David as a former boyfriend named David Meyer Bell, but is reluctant to provide more information because she fears for her life. And you can't blame her. David was abusive towards his first wife and had apparently murdered his second wife. After he fled, he had lived in different places: American Samoa, Florida, Haiti, and Alaska. And at the time he was captured, he was married to a 20-year-old Samoan woman. and had landed a job as a chief pilot for Samoa Air, a small commercial airline. His wife thought David's ex had died in a tragic accident and had no idea what was really going on, that he was actually on the run and David Meyer Bell was not his real name. He was apprehended on his way to work. He admitted his true identity and voluntarily agreed to return to Michigan to stand trial. Still, David claimed that this whole thing was a huge misunderstanding. Shannon was not a good rider and had lost control and fallen from the horse. It was just an accident. He still claimed that he loved her and he ran away because he was scared of going to jail on false accusations. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lucille said, quote, "We went out to the cemetery right afterwards and we looked down at her grave and said, 'We got him.'" End quote. David remained in prison until November 9, 2014, when he died at the age of 70. Sadly, by this point, Bob and Lucille had already passed away. Please leave any theories or comments you might have for us down below. We're really interested to know what you think about this case.